I think we're all very used to things not being perfect,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the fun part of doing this, I guess, or quote unquote fun part. So I'm going to kick off, and if anything falls through the cracks, guess what? We'll figure it out. Gee, I just said
All
that.
right.
Didn't I? We'll figure it out. Get it? Amy Biancolli is a gray-haired mama and an ink-stained wretch and my friend. She's also a survivor of suicides, a journalist for Mad and America.com, a former arts writer at the Albany Times Union, a lover of movies, and former critic for the Houston Chronicle. Amy is a player of the violin, a singer of alto lines, a person of faith who believes that God loves without discriminating, and guess what? So should we. She's a dabbler in plays and the author of 3 books, including the memoir Figuring Shit Out: Love, Laughter, Suicide, and Survival. Amy Biancolli, thank you for joining us in conversation with. Amy, would you read from Figuring Shit Out?
I'd be honored to. Chapter 3, Social Security. My dad regards me again across the table. He taps it. You should call Social Security, he says. I'll have some money, thank you. Right. You should do that as soon as possible. Right. I mean, as soon as possible, this week, within the next few days, today. Right. He taps again. He hums. This is his way of saying, I won't stop bugging you until you make that call. I won't leave you alone until you do whatever the fuck you need to do to get up and get moving forward. And yes, if he were to vocalize this thought, he would be sure to include the word fuck. He swears a lot. Here, I should note that my dad hasn't always been my dad. First, he was my headmaster, my teacher, my advisor, and my coach. Then he became my friend, Dan Richardson. Then he and his wife, Pat, became my extra parents, and their kids became my bonus siblings. Then they became the people who agreed to raise me and my sister, Lucy, in the event of our parents' deaths. The nice thing about Amy, he once told a friend, is that if the right number of people die, she becomes my daughter. Then, some years later, my sister killed herself and my parents died, all within a 2-year span. My surrogate brother, Danny, then emailed me to say, consider my parents yours. And that was that. The Richardsons all stopped being surrogate. They became my family, period. My dad became my dad. When he heard Chris had finally gone and killed himself after 3 hospitalizations and a catastrophic 6-month bout of insomnia, anxiety, and depression, he packed up the Honda and drove to Albany. At home, his wife, Pat, my mom, was nursing a cold 6 weeks after a transplant operation, the kidney, a gift from Danny. She couldn't come, but Dan did, huffing through the door like a shambling 6'2" blast of practicality, compassion, and hope.
Thank you, Amy.
That still kind of hits me. And Dan, Pat died shortly after the book was finished, not before it was published, and then Dan just died the month before COVID. So that's a lot. Like, I'm reading this chunk and the presence of losing Chris and remembering the loss of Pat shortly thereafter, and then the loss of Dan, which is also pretty huge. So
Thank you. I know that I asked you to read that, and just so all of our listeners know, that's chapter 3 of Figuring Shit Out. And at this point in the book, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 have introduced us very, very quickly to the knock on the door, to the notification of Chris's suicide and your husband, and your engaging in trying to console your own children, two that were home at the time, local, and one that was overseas somewhere, if I remember right.
In Ecuador. Yeah, she was doing a gap year.
That's right. And having to make that phone call and having to have that communication. And now we're on a chapter in Chapter 3, as you're navigating, is the best word I can come up with, but stumbling would probably be a better one, is it's called Social Security. And it's the way you read that, of course, had a lot of resonance for me, the way I feel about belonging in this world, and coupling that with my loss of my biological family and then as being adopted. And the idea of finding and belonging has become really something you and I have talked about from the first time we met. And I currently belong to the 12-step fellowships, and we are in that road of healing now. Even after 35 years of sobriety, I'm still in that path of healing. And you've been very understanding as I've shared my own journey with suicidal feelings and the real fears that I've had. I'd like to ask you to talk about belonging. And 2011 is when Chris passed, when he died. And that's been a long time now, hasn't it? And how has your
Yeah.
how have the days and the years gone by, and your sense of belonging with family, with people, with new customs, because those clouds are painted above your head, and they're here as a reminder, but you've had to move forward. I hate to use the phrase move on. Yeah, there's Chris's clouds.
Yeah.
What
I
is
love
it?
them.
What has it been like to move forward one step at a time, or stumbling one step at a time, and finding new ways of belonging and new people to belong with?
Yeah. That's kind of it, isn't it? That's the challenge for anybody, because we're all stumbling. I mean, 10 years, it blows my mind. I can't wrap my head around it, because on the one hand, it feels like yesterday, in the sense that I can take myself back to that moment when the cops showed up at the door, like that. Boom, there they are. The sense of being stabbed with the reality of losing my husband of 20 years. That's never going to disappear. I mean, that's the thing that I had learned long ago with grief, as I lost my sister Lucy, as I said in the reading that I just did, to suicide. That was 1994. And so I knew that grief just does whatever the hell it wants to do. And that you don't get over something. You don't get over a loss. Your life grows around it, gets bigger. But it's always there. You can always kind of use this time machine or hyperforce to get back there at any point. And like it hurts. It still hurts. But at the same time, I'm not there with that hurt all the time, because my world has grown around it. This is how I always try to explain it. And when I say explain it, I mean even to myself. So I look back on these 10 years, and it's not like they were easy. I mean, there weren't, but they were at various points, for many reasons, filled with joy. They were filled with different types of pain and frustration. Not every stage of it was easy, especially right afterward. But what astonishes me is that, yes, on the one hand, it's still there. It's still there. That loss is still there, and in a way still immediate. But on the other hand, it seems like a lifetime ago. It's very strange, this dichotomy, because I look around and I see, I look at look at my kids. My youngest was 11 when he lost his dad, and he's now about to turn 21. He took 2 amazing gap years. He's grown so much. He's now down at Brooklyn College physically after doing his first year remotely. And my daughters are just they're amazing. There's like you know how it is when your kids grow up. You're amazed that they're adults, but to me it's just like, wow, that's astonishing. And then all the new friends and connections I've made since losing Chris also blows me away. My world, I always feel like if you lose enough people, and I know, loss, so you know how it is. You're like, my world is shrinking. My world is shrinking. And you always want to expand it. And it's just like, that's why connection is so important to me. And that's why the Richardsons are so important to me. And it's like, I am connected. My universe has expanded. And Chris used to say to me, this was after my childhood family died, he would say to me, Amy, it was really funny. And one of the things I loved about him is he had a really dark sense of humor, and he knew that I did too. So he said, for someone whose family is dead, you have a lot of relatives, which is true. And I laughed so hard, and I've repeated that countless times because he knew about the Richardsons. And then I've got my half sister and her family who, and then I've got my uncle just died, but my aunt and uncle's family, the Mitchell's family. I've got so many, and the Richardsons, and I'm just like, it's this network. And after Chris died, I found myself not consciously, or I'm sure that subconsciously I was doing it, but I was pressing outward in a new way. And, not just dating again and, a couple tries and fails in that regard. But even that expanded, even like the broken relationships expanded my universe in a way and connected me with people that I really care about in a new way. And then, another thing, and I know I'm going on about it, but it's a huge question and it's been hugely important to me, is that in the midst of one of these kind of transitions, in early 2016, I fell in with this group of amazing, wonderful people who are passionate jazz musicians. And I fell into the whole hot club jazz community, Django Reinhardt, all that music from the 1930s Paris. And now I'm playing in a band, and I'm in a wonderful relationship with this bandmate of mine, and the rest of my there, and I love them. Like they're such good friends, and the whole world, like the whole Django community, they're incredible friends. And then other friends that I've met, like you, and then when I went back to the Times Union after I got laid off from Houston, I went back to the Times Union and I reconnected with old friends, but I also made wonderful new friends. And so, like in the 10 years since Chris died, my universe has only grown. And it's like I'm going on and on about it because it's huge in every sense to me.
You used a wording because I asked you about moving forward, and you used the word outward. I started moving outward, and I have this sense of the expansion, the expanding. And I had a friend pass, Nancy, this past year. She didn't die of COVID, but she had a lung disorder. And I remember this huge, huge just hole in my life. I can hardly talk about it now. It's hard. It's still very fresh. And I remember a lot of people really wanted to comfort me. And one person said to me I sit with you. I sit with you. And yep. I know that reference and I understand it, but I just sat and cried when I heard that, when I got that from her. And there was a hole that was there in my life. And that hole right now, Nancy, you can't fill that hole. Don't try to help me fill that hole. I don't want to fill that hole. I miss Nancy. You miss Chris. But I need to sit there for right now. I need to be near that emptiness. And I just need to know that people are with me. And the important part of it was, and I heard you just say it, is as I decided to not sit and to try to move again, to move outward is a great way to say it, because the hole is still there. I'm always going to be
Yeah.
returning to, I can return to that emptiness, I can return to that grief, but I also know that I can move outward from that. And I love the way you said it's kind of your world has just grown around it, because the hole is still there. I think of it as gardening. You know, the hole in the ground's there, and I'm
Mhm.
not going to fill it up, but I'm going to plant new plants around it, and I'm going to have new ways of looking at the world. And this part of the year is very difficult for me. My dad died 11 years ago, coming up, and it wasn't even when he died that was the worst part. It's October, but it's now, because the seasons are changing, and this is when he got very sick. So that emptiness is still very fresh for me sometimes this time of the year. And yet I recognize that I can sit with that and I can move outward from it. I love the way you said
Yep. Yeah. Well, I know, and the thing is, like, early on when we started talking, I think one of the reasons we made a connection is because, your story is different from mine. What you've gone through, I didn't go through. What I went through, you didn't go through. But you've had so much loss. There's been so many struggles that you've carried, and you comprehend that a person can be both whole and at the same time have broken pieces. And that's the other, I mean, I don't mean to put words into your mouth, but that's my other way of grappling with it. Yet, yes, I love that, how beautifully you said that, like there's a hole in the garden, but you plant around it. And at the same time, someone else characterized it as, I thought this was an interesting metaphor too, like you're still whole, you're like a windshield that's been in an accident, and the pieces don't scatter because of the nature of a windshield. Like you retain the shape, but you have these broken pieces inside. And that's part of how I think of it too, because like I can't deny that this happened to me, and it still doesn't hurt, it's still a loss. All these were still losses, but I'm still me. And so long as I still feel connected, I can, not make sense of it, but yeah, keep going outward, I guess.
I'm still me. I love that phrase. I'm still me. My sister Julie. Hi, Julie. I don't talk about her too often, but it's my biological family that I found in my journey. And
Right.
Julie has struggled greatly, as in the book, with a lot of trauma and of course addiction and recovery. And after she read the book, I remember I just visited her this past year in Colorado, and she was able to tell me. She said, when you wrote about, I was talking to our brother James about Julie, and we were talking about how much she had been in pain and hurt and broken. And the way I described it was, even Julie's broken pieces are broken. And
Mm,
she said, when I read that, and that could be hard for someone to read if I'm saying it about someone and if you're reading it about yourself. And the word she
yeah.
used when she talked to me, she said it made her feel like I got her, that I understood. So noticing the broken pieces and noticing that the
Yeah.
windshield is shattered is
Yeah.
different than trying to pretend it's not. And accept
Right.
that I'm going to sit with you even in your brokenness, because I want you to sit with me. I'm in my brokenness too.
Yeah.
And it was really beautiful for her to say that. I'm glad that you see my broken pieces are broken because you get me, you understand me. Yep.
Yeah.
That's exactly the connection we need.
Yeah. That's beautiful. That's just beautiful. And like someone else might say, well, you can either say we're all broken or like, it's not like we should go around trying to fix each other. I don't like that idea. I think probably everyone in this life has had someone who tried to fix them. And it's not that so much. It's just, I feel like it's sort of a cognitive behavioral thing. If I'm aware of the painful parts inside of me, the broken pieces, then I can feel whole around them. You know what I mean? It's like grappled with it constantly and I understand that it's irrational, but the sense of guilt that's inevitable after you lose someone to suicide. So, someone you love dies by suicide. The, the people around that person, they ask all these questions. Why? What did I do? What could I have done? What did I say? What should I have said? Oh, I shouldn't have done this. Or I should have, oh, it's my fault. I should have known. I should have gone there. I should have done. And it's like you read yourself this litany of questions. And it's just, oh my God, I failed this person I love. I failed this person I love. I didn't love well enough. And so the guilt is just, I wish I could just like wave the magic wand and take that piece and just throw it out. But what I know, and I had a therapist who really helped me with this after Chris died. She said, look, Chad, just when it hits you, allow yourself to sit with it for a certain period of time, X number of minutes, 15 minutes, half an hour. And she said, and then when you're done, just say, okay. And you just you give it its due. And as you're giving it its due, you're recognizing that it's irrational. It's like the rational part of me recognizes that it's irrational, but that is the most freeing thing because it's acknowledging that it's in there. It's not trying to say, oh, stop, Amy, don't feel that. Don't feel that. You shouldn't feel that. It's like, no, when it bubbles up, I'm gonna feel it. So on some conscious level, if I recognize that I'm just being human and feeling that, but saying, just don't fall too far into that hole, like, don't spend too much time in there. Just like allow yourself a little bit of time crying in a puddle and then move on that was one of the most freeing things anybody said to me. It's like, you don't have to deny this broken piece inside you, but you can still be whole around it. You know what I mean?
I do. I want to switch gears from our topic of suicide to addiction and recovery for a second. Judith Grisel, who wrote the book Never Enough, talks about, and the subtitle is The Neuroscience and Experience of Addiction. And I love how she added that in there because Judith Grisel has as much sobriety as I do. I think 35, 36 years. I became an actor and a writer, and she became a neuroscientist. And so we've had a few different, maybe some changes in the paths, but I love that she wrote this. And she talks about a set point, that we all have these neurological set points that our bodies are always trying to keep us on, and our minds, our central nervous system. We talk about the body and the mind as if they're separate. They're not. We're all really one organism there. And I love how she talks about the mind and the central nervous system, the neurological set point, and how when we are knocked off that set point by grief, by traumas, for me it was by the adoption and the abandonment, and also by the molestation and the child sexual abuse. When we get knocked off that, our bodies, our mind, our central nervous system, neurologically, we're trying to find that set point. And when it's that difficult, addiction can become almost an option, a rational option, to drink, to use drugs, to try to find that set point because the dopamine is off kilter and your chemicals in your body are really struggling.
Right.
I do know about brokenness, and I do know about definitions to addiction and recovery and the ideas. And I like her book. I want to read from a different book for a second. It's from a chapter called Measuring Results, Measuring the Soul. And it's a section called Free to Change. And it's a book called The Soul of Recovery. Those promoting the brain disease concept claim it reduces the stigma of addiction. But how will addicts benefit if other people view them as having a chronic, relapsing disease brought about by defective brains? To say addiction is not the person's fault in this way is to say that they have a permanent condition. Faulty neurochemistry, reprogrammed molecules over which they have no control. While they may stop drinking or drugging, that deformed brain will still be in there, ready to hijack the addict back into their habit. That's powerful for me. I want to go on though, because, and this book, of course, is written by someone you know very well. We'll talk about that in a second. Chris goes on to talk about, for while sin is temporary, a mental health diagnosis can be forever. In the eyes of a scientifically inclined society, those so labeled cannot change. Now, there's much more wrapped around. This is a book by someone named Chris Ringwald. And to all of our listeners and watchers, this book is Amy's husband's book.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book.
It is a beautiful book, and there's some powerful passages in there. And that was one of them that, even as I was thinking about it earlier today, I didn't know if we'd get to it, but I'm glad I made a little bookmark for myself, because while Judith Grisel really talks about the neuroscience, the neurochemistry, and this set point, Chris was talking about it in 2002, and he was looking at that and the warning signs that he was really holding up of overdefining or misdefining or labeling, and also what you and I were just talking about. Are we broken people? Are we damaged people? Can we heal? What? So you've heard me read and talk for a couple of seconds, but I wanted you to respond to what I just read from Chris's words.
Well, yeah, it's very powerful stuff. I'm reminded of it constantly in my new job with Mad in America, because Chris and I both learned so much about this through initially, well, Chris learned about it, obviously, as he was working on the book, but also our friend Robert Whitaker, who wrote Mad in America and Anatomy of an Epidemic. He's the one who really started to get people to challenge the paradigm, the disease paradigm, saying maybe we shouldn't be locking people into this model of not just addiction, but other diagnoses that's promulgated by God, that's a terribly awkward word to say, promulgate. I don't think I've ever said it. I think I've written it, but never said it. I'm going to stick to
and now it'll
to
be
writing.
now it's enshrined on YouTube for all time.
Yeah, I'm never again going to try to say it, but yeah, and that whole disease model and how it locks people in. I mean, some people might get some benefit by some drugs, but it's based on, so huge. It's based on a conception that was flawed from the beginning. This idea that, if you're suffering from X, Y, or Z, it's because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. And actually, the research never really showed that. It was just early on, in different instances, Big Pharma used that basically as a pitch line, like, this is what we've got. It will change your brain chemistry for the good. And again, when it works, we don't really know when it works. But this question is still, should we be labeling people for life, saying, okay, as that passage you read just said, like, well, okay, if you're going to be burdened with this, if you're hardwired with this and you're going to be burdened with it for the rest of your life, what does that mean? And for some people, in some instances, that might be liberating, saying, oh, it's not my fault. It's a way of saying it's not my fault. If I'm this, if the establishment says, okay, it's not your fault, it's something that's ingrained in your DNA, then okay, it's not my fault. But for somebody else, it might be a burden, saying, oh my God, this is lifelong. What am I going to do? So yeah, Chris was writing about that early on. Our friend Bob was writing about it, still writing about it. And it's a huge, huge question. And yeah, that's a lot that I just threw at you, but
no, it's what I've enjoyed reading in your columns, and of course following Mad in America and reading Chris's words. And it is something that, of course, I take a very personal interest in, because we've veered very quickly, or directed ourselves very quickly, from just the stigma of addiction to the stigma of mental health. And there's an interesting way that we're looking at it now, and there's a lot of studying about this. There's not just stigma in having mental health issues or addiction issues. Now there's
Yeah.
stigma. We point at stigmas around the different kinds of healing, the different kinds of processes, the different kinds of
Right.
treatment, so to speak. Uh,
Yeah.
One I wanted to ask you about, because it was an important read for me and something I've recommended to others, is what you wrote, The Lessons of Music, Nurturing Mental Health in Cultures Around the Globe. I found that to be
Yeah.
extraordinary, and I've read it over several times just for myself personally, and read it again before today. And one piece that I wanted to hopefully just hone in on, and then you can take it where you want, is training a person inward. Speaking of using music, playing music, being a part of a musical community that allows us
Hmm.
to focus on the music and with it
Hmm.
mindfulness. And I'll read just from what you wrote. Playing it leads to an individual centered serenity. That's its purpose. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, thank you for reading. Those stories are so long. There's so much in them. And to hear you say that you read them multiple times, like, wow, poor go Kevin. No, I mean, that was fascinating to work on that series, just generally, just I gotta say, up from the start, because it just confirmed everything that I always knew from my own experience through music. And I really, just generally to comment once more about what we were talking before, like, and what you just said about certain types of treatment carrying stigma, I really believe that our challenge in life in general, and when it comes to mental health, is to figure out what works for us. And if something works for someone, that go with that. And nobody should be judged if something works for someone. If it's a drug or something, they if it works for them and they can get through life that way, and they can feel whole, great. Um, and I can't emphasize that enough, that I think it's up to each individual person to say, you know what, I figured out that I can feel well and happy by doing this, this, and this. It's like, great. For me, a huge piece of it, even before Chris died, has been music throughout my life. And working on that story and interviewing people who either have done, like, I've interviewed a lot of researchers, I interviewed a lot of people in different programs around the world, and it just underscored for me, it just reiterated over and over again just the beauties of music and how essential it is, again, at least for me, especially for me, to have something that is yeah, centering. I guess that's it. It's very, very centering. And it's wonderful to be able to focus on something that's completely outside everything else. And if I'm just practicing on my own, that focus is obviously it's all both outward and inward. I mean, I'm using you know, my physical body to make the sounds with the violin. I'm using my ears. It's one thing, music lights up every piece of your brain, like every piece of real estate in your brain. It's like one activity that does it all. But if I'm playing, I mean, that's true even if I'm just practicing in my bedroom. But if I'm playing or singing with other people, then there's this social component on top of it. So on the one hand, it's the focus that says, okay, I can't be worrying about whatever, what's going on in my checking account or this or that or the leak or this or whatever. I got to get this fixed. I'm not worrying about those things because I'm focused on the music. It's very insistent in that way. Because if you don't focus on the music, you crash and burn, like you make mistakes going skiing and spacing out. You got to pay attention the whole time you're going skiing or you crash. But when I'm with other people, we're doing something that, I mean, yeah, we talk in between, and, with my band, we'll even talk about arrangements and stuff. And it's not like there aren't, issues that we have to fix that and, play that differently or things to discuss, but we're doing something together. So it's both centering in a personal sense, and it connects you with other people, and you're able to create something bigger than yourselves. And to me, it's like, it's just, and I've made so many friends just through music. And sometimes it takes a while to get to know them. Like, oh, really? You do this for a living? Oh, you do that for a living? Like, we do a lot of small talk, at least not at first. It's just, oh yeah, I see that person at jams once a month. He's a great bass player, great guy. Oh, he's, and then you start learning about him. Like, oh, what? He's a physician specializing. Right? I was like, oh, wow. And it's just, but I'm able to make these essential human connections. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, but
I just wanted to hear that long-winded, and I never ask questions. I just say, "Can you tell us a little bit about that?" And I know
yeah, that's right. That's pretty sly.
I know. Well, I got it from it's probably some reporter thing. I think it's probably Terry Gross probably says that. So I
Yeah.
picked it up off Terry. She's my hero. I think what led me to even ask you about that a little bit, and I've always wanted to chat about that, was this week has been rough. We all have rough weeks up and down, and this week has been particularly difficult for me let's just be honest, from a mental health perspective. I think that's a really easy way for me to talk about it now. It doesn't mean I was off my meds or I needed to be hospitalized, but whatever was happening was definitely not, I wasn't at my set point. Things were really more of a struggle than they needed to be. And I talked to my brother, James. Hey, James. And, he gets me, just the way I told you, Julie felt like I got her. He gets me. And it's just this amazing connection that he and I can have. And at the end of it, he knew just what to do. He said, go listen to this song. And he literally said, go listen to Off the Ground by the record company. And I said, great, click, listen. And some of the lyrics are, well, my head is heavy and my heart is empty, but my spirit is strong and my legs are ready. Got to get myself up off the side of the road, quit lying to myself, and let the truth be told, go. So these were just these powerful instances of where and I mean, it's a really nice rockabilly blues song. So naturally, as soon as I jammed it, I cranked it up, and everything about me changed. It was almost like my DNA was waking up.
Yeah.
Right. And I felt fascinated by that. And I'm always interested in, like you said, what worked for me 10 years ago may not work for me today.
Yeah.
And I want to be willing to say to a doctor, to a therapist, to my wife, to my children, to myself, that's not working for me. I want to try something different. I need to move in a new direction.
Oh my gosh, that's so important. And I think a lot of people don't feel like they have agency.
Right.
And the more, this is again a huge topic, but the more sucked they get into the psychiatric system, the harder and harder it is for them to assert that agency, because people stop, that's one of the problems of the label, is that they stop being listened to. Like the system stops listening, stop being regarded as a whole person. Like, oh, you're saying that, but whatever your diagnosis is, borderline personality, you're saying that because you're borderline. And my sister got that. She was on so many, oh my God, she had been on so many drugs. She was hospitalized so many times. She was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. She was a tested genius at the time when she was first admitted to McLean in outside Boston. I guess I'm remembering this. I don't know if this is still the case, but she said they tested people's IQ when they first arrived, and they told her that she had the highest. Not that it matters, but the point being, she of all people, she was a Harvard graduate. She could advocate for herself. She was articulate. She was an amazing and persuasive human being in the best sense. And yet she couldn't get people to listen to her. And so people, it just seems it's just so essential that anybody, anywhere, they should be heard. And the problem in general is when people aren't heard. And frankly, Chris wound up being hospitalized a few times. And I remember him saying to me, this isn't therapeutic. And I he wasn't there for long. And I agreed with him. But what the tragedy in his case, in so many cases, is that people don't have options. They don't feel like they have options because the system isn't designed to give people options. And not to go completely off in that direction again, but it's hard not to.
It sure
you
is.
know
I was reading today just on a group that I belong to, and it was regarding the 12 step groups. And one of the issues or comments that was made was when people say things like, take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth. And they're
yeah
basically telling someone who's struggling in the early days to, stop talking and listen. And
yeah
there's some there's some valid validity in that. Just, sometimes we don't stop talking long enough to listen. And I remember it just happened to happen today, just a couple hours ago. I responded. I just thought one of my favorite slogans has been, we need to learn to listen and listen to learn. And
yeah
I like that better than shut up and listen, right? Because
yep
the learning to listen and listening to learn, that's broad. That's for the newcomer or the old timer. That's for the patient or the doctor. That's for the husband and the wife. We all need to be in that dialogue rather than it be more of, again, maybe a monologue or a prescriptive and
yeah
or even a descriptive. The story of Chris obviously is the figuring shit out story. I just want for our readers, for our listeners, to know why you brought up your sister in the way that you did, and because there's an enormous passion in the way you spoke. Can you tell our listeners what happened to your sister? What was that story?
yeah my sister Lucy, she I wrote about her in an earlier memoir called House of Holy Fools, which was my grief work really after I lost my childhood family, Lucy and my mom and dad. My Lucy died in April of 92, my dad in a couple months later, and then my mom in 94. So she had been sick for a long time. And the arc of her story it's so complicated, but she essentially, I don't know, who God knows, literally, I mean that literally, what the cause of it was, why she had to suffer the way she did. She probably had some head trauma when she was born. She was a forceps baby. In retrospect, she realized she had memories of hallucinations, even as a child. Ultimately, after years and years of diagnosis after diagnosis after diagnosis, hospitalization, drug, she was on God knows, I think 3 dozen drugs. She had been hospitalized 13 or 14 times. Ultimately, they wound up with a diagnosis of temporal lobe epilepsy, which can mimic psychosis, including hallucinations. And so she would have part of her experiences, part of her struggle, were these hallucinations. She would have either, sometimes she would feel bugs crawling up and down her arms, or she would hear things, more visual and sensory. But at the same time, she had been on so many drugs that she was also on drugs to combat the side effects. She was on antipsychotics, she was on seizure meds, she was on antidepressants, she was on benzodiazepines, she got early on, they put her on Xanax, she got addicted to Xanax. She was just, oh, good Lord. So whatever the initial cause was, like in my sister's case, it's incredibly likely that it was a trauma to the brain. Okay, so that was the root cause, was trauma to the brain and this temporal lobe epilepsy. That's the case. In some cases, yes, that the psychiatric struggles can come from trauma to the brain. But that was just one piece of it, because she had folded in with that were all of these other struggles. How to unpack them, I don't know, but it was like depression, suicidality. She had been diagnosed with everything. I mentioned the bipolar. She was diagnosed with that early on. She was diagnosed with major depression. She was diagnosed with, I mean, I've got lists of all the drugs she was on. And she was one of the most beautiful people that I've ever encountered. She was just sunshine. She was funny as hell. She was smart as hell. She was a concert pianist. She was an astonishing concert pianist. She was so gifted. She was so bloody smart. Harvard was her safety after she didn't get into Juilliard and Curtis School of Music. Oh, well, she got into Harvard. You know, it was her safety, you know, and and she was one of the most extraordinary human beings I've ever known. And I don't know, it's a giant question mark hanging over that. Why did she have to suffer that way? Why did she have to go through that unbelievable experience? And, you know, every time I interview someone or I read about someone's story when I'm working on something with Mad in America, and I think back and I'll read about alternative approaches to wellness. I'm like, why couldn't my sister, why couldn't that have been available to her that back then? You know, now there are all these efforts to help people taper off of psych drugs without going into withdrawal. Start out as mainly a peer-run movement, but I think, my God, what if that had been available for Lucy? What if she had been able to taper off? Like, I'm writing about a program in Vermont that it's holistic and helps people taper off meds. Like, what if, you know? But so that's Lucy.
Thank you. I know that our listeners, our watchers might have not known the depth of that, and I do, because I know you, and I also have read that story. I'm gonna read one more thing in print. It's to Amy Jean Biancolli Ringwald, my wife and best editor, colleague and conversationalist, who came late to religion but was always of God. And I need to ask you why that last line, who came late to religion, and especially, where are you now, but was always of God?
Wow. Okay, I'm choking up a little.
I'll give you a second while I tell.
No.
I'll give you a second while I tell our listeners. I always want to say our readers, our listeners, that this is the dedication for Chris's book, and I'll put this link down below for anyone that wants to read Chris's book, The Soul of Recovery. And I thought that was important, and maybe an important way to end is speaking of what I refer to as higher power quite often, God.
Yeah.
And I really am not trying to go down the rabbit hole of religion versus spirituality, but that's a topic that's very often broached. Is, you know, I'm spiritual, not religious. I'm this, I'm that. But that dedication really spoke loudly to me, and it was when Chris wrote it, which was, of course, probably when he was still struggling in many ways, but he had found some.
Well, when he wrote that, no, actually, just to clarify, his struggle, I always put it, he was the sanest guy I ever knew. And then 6-month period, and then I'll answer your question. There's a 6-month period before his suicide that he just declined. He stopped sleeping, which to me is like, oh my God, if they could have solved that, the rest wouldn't have happened. But he stopped sleeping. Ambien kept him awake at night. He got, you know, with the lack of sleep, depression, anxiety, and it became this, you know, vicious circle. And then he slept less, and it was 6 months. It was a 6-month end. And so that, to me, and just one more thing to say, is that there's no us and them with mental health. It's not, oh, that person is mentally ill and that person is not. No, we're all on a spectrum. We're all freaking human. We all struggle. We all have our periods of suffering. Anybody can get hit. Anybody can. As I said, like I'll say it again, Chris was the sanest guy I ever knew. He had his issues, but who doesn't? And he had everything he had gone through. When we were married, he was as whole as I can't imagine him being less whole than he was the 20 years we were married. And then he had this descent. So to me, it's like, yeah, okay, don't think anybody that there's an us and them here, that it's binary, that, okay, I'm mentally healthy and you're mentally ill. No, we all, it's like, set aside the idea of mental illness and the idea of mental health being just for people who don't struggle. No, we all have to work on our mental health. We all suffer and struggle, stumble. So, okay, I just had to say that. And the God thing. Okay, this is part of also what I wrote about in my earlier memoir. I grew up in a house that was atheist agnostic. My father was devoutly atheistic, and my mother was agnostic. What they always said to me and Lucy was, we don't believe in God, you guys decide for yourselves. Okay, so we didn't either, but they never badmouthed religion. Well, my dad didn't like religion, but they just basically said, you guys decide. And then when I was 10, almost 11, my mother almost died of heart failure and kidney failure. And as she was lying in the hospital bed in ICU, drowning in her own lungs, literally, she said, I haven't been good to God. And then asked herself, wait, where did that come from? I don't believe in God. And that started her on this very long questioning period, when she was saying, why did I think that? What was going on? She just kind of explored different types of spirituality, started a conversation with me. My dad was totally uninterested in it, but started a conversation with me and Lucy. Several years, and ultimately following different paths. And I swear this is true. First, my mother converted to Catholicism. She befriended a convent of Benedictine nuns, and she became Catholic. My sister, around the same time, shortly thereafter, on our own path, up at Harvard, converted. In her case, she actually had visions, because of her hallucinations. Maybe they were actual visions. Maybe she actually sat with God in her dorm room, and that's what your brain does. I don't know, but maybe it was just her illness. But she had this ecstatic experience. So she wound up converting. Then I was very stubborn about it. I became kind of gradually spiritual. Started going to some Episcopal services when I was home from college, where my mother played organ, because she was a violinist, but she would also play organ with the church. And then before she became Catholic, and I was like, yeah, I'm not going to become Catholic. I'm not going to become Catholic. I'm not going to become Catholic. No. They're Catholic. I'm not going to become Catholic. But meanwhile, in college, I was reading Flannery O'Connor and Graham Greene, and was fascinated by Catholicism. And then when I was living abroad, I was living in Scotland for a year after college, which is a very Protestant country, which was interesting. And I learned a lot about that from that end. At the same time, I found myself reading histories and books about Judaism, right? And I found myself just really, really drawn to the roots, the original monotheism. And it occurred to me while I was over there that, hey, by that point I was Christian. I'm like, well, I can't really convert to Judaism because I do believe in the divinity of Christ, But Catholicism, the Catholic Church is the closest. It's like it's the closest. You know, it tracks the farthest back. It's the original Christian church, and to me, it was the Eucharist. Like, you can trace the Eucharist is the unending piece of it for me. And you know, as a human being, do I understand it? No. Do I think the church is perfect? God, no. I have my issues with it. It's a human structure. Like every Catholic alive, I'm sure I've struggled with it over the years with all these different revelations. But I keep going back to it for the Eucharist, in the sense that I'm just on a path. I mean, I don't think that people have to be religious. I don't think people have to believe in God. My father, Dan, who my second dad, they were both atheists. My dad wound up converting on his deathbed, but they were two of the best, most loving, giving people I know. They had such moral compasses, both of them. So to me, it's like we love definitions, right? We're human beings. We love to class people, like to say, oh, you're over there, I'm over there. I'm in this, I'm Catholic, so I'm over here. You're an atheist, so you're over there, you're over there, you're over there. But we're just all called to be good and loving. And the way I always describe it, and I had this conversation with a couple of young men I met, these two Mormon guys that were walking along New Scotland Avenue, and we wound up chatting, and I was telling them, I'm not going to convert, but we wound up having an interesting conversation. And I told them that I think of it as we're all we're all standing in a huge circle, and at the center here's the outward thing again, right? But except in this case, going the other direction, inward. In the middle is the source of all light and love. Like, whatever, call it what you want. Call it God, call it goodness, call it love, just whatever name, Allah. It's like, call it and whatever. It doesn't matter what name you call it. It's the source of all light and love. And we can either spend our lives walking toward it or away from it. And most of us, we take a few steps toward it, we stumble, we fall back, we make mistakes, we move forward, we stumble. But as we inch closer, we see each other's faces. And so we don't demonize one another. It brings us closer to each other when we move closer to love. And that, to me, that's like the whole God spiritual thing. I think of it as God. Geez, okay, I'm Catholic. That's me. I'm trying to walk toward that source of light. But someone else, you know, can be an incredibly loving, decent, giving, good human being who's also walking toward the light, and they don't call it by the same name I call it. They might not call it any name at all. So that's how I think of it.
There's you may have read about this, Greg Epstein. He's the author of Good Without God.
Right.
And he's an atheist, as you well know then, and he's the new chief chaplain at Harvard.
Yeah.
And I was so fascinated by that that I'm now going to probably read the book, which I haven't, and I'm very attracted to the topics. I also just feel that seeing each other,
Yeah.
and I see you and me, I see me and you. Many times what I recognize and want to always remind myself, but remind anyone is, and I've mentioned this before in other interviews, you know, it's not just me and you here right now, Amy. It's just not. It's just not. And I don't see life that way, that it's just two people chatting right now. There's something else happening. And I know maybe this is a recording now and a bunch of people are watching this on YouTube. I'm not referring to that. I mean, we're a conduit. You know, whatever your spiritual light is, my spiritual understanding, we're a conduit for that, towards each other, with each other, and seeing that and allowing that and accepting that. I guess the big word is wanting that. I don't want to be spiritually pushing my understanding on someone else. I also don't want to be spiritually, you know, void in my relationships with other people. So I have to find that. And I don't think it's a balance. I just want those guardrails to be up a little bit.
Yeah, we just want to be seen. We just want to be heard. We just want to see. We want to hear one another. And or maybe sometimes the problem is we don't want to see and hear one another. But yeah, again, I just think like when we see each other face to face across the lake, um, you can't demonize someone. You can't. It's impossible. Because you're greeting them as human. You're seeing them as human, and you're seeing them. They're striving for the same things that we are, and nobody knows anything. What do we know? We have no idea where we come from or where we're headed. Ultimately, we say that we know, but we don't. We don't know.
I was just writing about it yesterday, Amy. Not only don't I know, I don't want to know all the answers anymore. I don't want to. I want to be, as you say, I want to be figuring shit out, not figured it all out. I want to be
Yeah.
I want to be searching.
Yep. That's what we're called to do. Just search. It's the search, isn't it?
Amy Biancolli is a gray-haired mama and an ink-stained wretch and my friend. She's also a survivor of suicides, a journalist for Mad and America.com, a former arts writer at the Albany Times Union, a lover of movies, and former critic for the Houston Chronicle. Amy is a player of the violin, a singer of alto lines, a person of faith who believes that God loves without discriminating, and guess what? So should we. She's a dabbler in plays and the author of 3 books, including the memoir, Figuring Shit Out, Love, Laughter, Suicide, and Survival. Amy, thank you again so much for joining us in conversation with.
Thank you, Kevin. This was it was a wonderful, beautiful conversation. Thank you.
I agree. I hope to see you in person soon. I miss you.
Looking forward.
Cool.